As modern America continues her holy crusade to rewrite her history by claiming that everything is racist, the truth of how our nation de-evolved into what it is now is more muddled every day. No less is this true than in the revised history of modern American urbanism. Modern progressivism teaches about how the car killed the American city, how a group of oil corporations, big car, and motorist clubs conspired together to create Strodes and Walmart parking lots. The villain in the shadows who influenced American zoning laws, demolished downtowns for highways, and don't worry, they're also racist. Though, when you look into the history of American urban development, you realize that factors which led up to the American over-reliance on the car were almost purely circumstantial. And the more you look into American urbanism, the more discrepancies you see between the new narrative and what was set in stone, or in this case, steel. This was Pittsburgh in the 1930s, grimy, polluted, and full of smelly Pennsylvanians. Not the nicest of places. This was Pittsburgh 20 years later. What the fuck? During the post-war period, Pittsburgh demolished its entire downtown and rebuilt it from the ground up so the city of steel could become a beacon of what all American cities should become. Locally, this event was known as the Pittsburgh Renaissance, but in more proper terms, this process is referred to as urban renewal. While Pittsburgh's transformation was in the 1940s to 1960s, the urban renewal movement can stem its origins all the way back to the turn of the century. Urban renewal was an evolved version of the City Beautiful movement. Though, instead of decreasing poverty by focusing on a city's visual beauty, it focused on lowering poverty-related inflictions by actually attempting to fight poverty directly. But the movement wouldn't gain any traction until the problem of adequate housing would be pushed to its absolute limit following the end of the Second World War. Young American GIs were coming home to find the land of the pseudo-homeless, as there wasn't enough housing to go around. Especially on the West Coast, the Second World War saw the greatest increase of urbanization in American history up to that point. So in 1949, the Housing Act was passed, and a part of the new bill was funding given to cities to rebuild their urban cores. Early on, the process seemed to be a major win-win for everyone involved. Cities used their money to buy or in many cases forcibly take land within their borders to put on market for cheap. Companies bought up the land for below market value to redevelop, and cities got modernized infrastructure, commercial office space, and civic centers for practically free. Third world housing accommodations were replaced with relatively affordable quality units, and all of the construction was seen as a tool to revitalize the local economy. But I want you to put a pin in this for now, because this is where we meet up with the new narrative again. Because, under the hood, more sinister forces were at play. According to Vox News, urban renewal was being guided by institutionalized racism. The interstates specifically were a justification to demolish black neighborhoods. But why did highways run through the urban core of major American cities? Well, it couldn't be because of the popularity of the car in the US. According to the Medium, as late as 1939, cars were still fighting off a negative reputation for being dangerous machines of death. The old urbanist claims that by the 1940s, only under half of Americans owned a car, and by the time of the Second World War, that number was declining. This is corroborated by the National World War II Museum of New Orleans, who states that the auto industry and the US government were at odds with one another due to how damaging the wartime rationing was to the industry. Alright, so this is during editing. The World War II Museum claims that 80% of American households owned a car by the 1940s. The old urbanist claims that just under half of American households owned a car. The reason why I'm still sticking with the old urbanist's claim is because they actually provided a source, being the US Census. The World War II Museum does not provide a source for that statistic. So, by the post-war period, despite being composed of some of the most profitable companies, politically, the car lobby, if you could even call it that, wasn't very powerful, especially considering how much they got absolutely shafted by Uncle Sam. All of this contradicts the modern anti-car mythos. According to both Vox and the Harvard Crimson, the story goes that President Eisenhower signed the Interstate Highway Act under the influence of the car lobby, as evidenced by the fact that he commissioned Charles Wilson, a former CEO of General Motors, to design the interstate highways. Though, an ill-forgotten fact is that back when modern American urban planning was being shaped, highway construction was more of a business of war, not of civic transportation, as evidenced by the fact that Charles Wilson was the at the time Secretary of Defense. The whole reason why Eisenhower was a big proponent of the cross-country highways was because of the 1919 convoy, which was an army expedition to prove that the DoD could react in time in case of an invasion of the West Coast. Though, by mid-century, a much larger threat was facing the potential home front. In 1949, the Reds dropped their first atomic bomb, which sent the US into a frenzy, fearing that New York could become the next Nagasaki. In an address made by at-the-time Vice President Richard Nixon at a 1954 Governor Conference, he mentioned that one of the important aspects of the future highway is to meet the demands of a hypothetical post-apocalyptic America. This shows in the way that interstate highways were designed. One major difference between the American interstates and German Autobahn is that the American highways ran right through the downtown. This was intentionally designed so that the interstates could be used as tools to evacuate the urban cores in case of a nuclear war. Interstates were also designed in a way to help rebuild and resettle America following nuclear Armageddon. According to Dan McNichols, writer of the book The Roads That Built America, interstates were designed in a way so survivors can settle down around the crater of what was once a great American city. This also plays into why post-war American houses are spaced out in the way they were. While it does have a post-industrial mock of what Jefferson dreamed for the United States, urban sprawl also had a very practical contingency for what was at the time believed to be the inevitable. Since, in the car-centric suburbs, houses were spaced out, more Americans would survive the nuclear holocaust. So, the reason why the modern American suburb is car-centric is because of the bomb, not because of the car lobby. But fear of nuclear Armageddon doesn't explain why sections of major American urban cores look like they suffered from a nuclear Armageddon. Which loops us back to the subject of urban renewal. You see, with the reconstruction of American cities, there was one massive caveat, a poison which has forever tainted the reputation of urban renewal. By the time urban renewal was being properly implemented, neighborhoods in large sections of cities and towns across America were redlined. The practice of redlining has its origins in the New Deal. It was a collaborative mapping effort between the Federal Housing Administration and the Homeowners Loan Corporation to show banks which areas were safe to insure a loan. The problem was that redlining made equity building for those who lived in the redline areas practically impossible. So, the issue was that these bad neighborhoods got worse because the banks didn't want to give out loans to buy new homes, start new businesses, or pursue economic opportunity. And due to financial institutions wanting no part in these neighborhoods, their degradation would lead to their land values plummeting. Worst case scenario would be a renewed cycle of poverty, and the situation getting so out of hand that the city would declare the neighborhood as a slum and just outright demolish the area. Look familiar? Once again, we meet up with the new narrative, but they add an extra dialogue of it being le racist. Though, unlike other times in which the race card has been pulled, the claim that redlining had a malintent for minorities is to be found. It was implemented by the Roosevelt administration. For those of you who don't know, the cripple was probably one of the most racist presidents in all of American history. Now, to what extent minorities were affected can be contested. Mainstream articles which cover the topic of urban renewal and redlining tend to hyperfixate on black communities. But, according to data collected from the Renewing Inequality Project done by the University of Richmond, it shows that urban renewal affected both black and white neighborhoods, and by the 1960s more white neighborhoods were being demolished than black neighborhoods. Yet you don't find article upon article decrying their loss. And once again, to add to this, the notion that the interstates were being used to justify the destruction of black neighborhoods, as claimed by Vox, is built on a half-truth. To meet with Eisenhower's demand, the construction of the interstates was a lot like the flow of a river, taking the path of least resistance, or in this case, taking the cheapest path. And due to urban renewal, more specifically redlining, the cheapest path sometimes meant demolishing an ethnic neighborhood. So as much as you can claim that the interstate highway shaped urban renewal, it is equally true, if not more so, that urban renewal shaped the interstate highway. The modern mythos has the story of American urbanism completely on its head, not helped by the fact that the narrative tends to overstate certain elements of truth while downplaying others. Modern urbanists can tell you all the symptoms, but ultimately come to a misdiagnosis. I'm not saying that they're wrong with their complaints about car-centric culture. It's just that if they want to find a solution, they have to stop barking up the wrong tree. Because if there's anything I want you to take away from this video, it is that the solution of today's metropolitan ailments can easily warp into tomorrow's urban problems. This has been Mr. Asian Pie. See you on the flip, and don't be stupid.